Don't start it quite yet. I have one question.
We ready? All right then.
I wanted to know about communion Sunday.
We'll go ahead and ask. Whoever's watching might want to know the same question.
How did you handle the communion wine?
How did I handle the what?
Out of the chalice.
Oh, that? Oh, well, it almost, thank God I had a beard. So at least it could kind of catch it before it hit my shirt. But I didn't realize there was a little tiny cup inside the cup.
Yeah.
Our chalice
Because
got
it's
deteriorated from the
Yeah,
wine,
from the wine.
so if you would put the wine right into the chalice, you would taint it.
Yeah.
And so
then
we
we put it-
took just a little plastic container, and
Oh,
we just
sure,
put the
sure,
wine in there.
I knew something had happened, but I wasn't quite sure what had happened.
And
And it was
so,
all I could do not to go, what in the name of God? I figured with it being the blood of Christ was probably not the right thing to say.
it was so funny because I just gave it to him and he kind of looked and you could see he was gonna lift that plastic out and then he went, I don't think I should.
Yeah,
And so I just went to the organ real quick so I could start doing.
yeah. You ran to the organ.
Yeah, you did, you ran.
Too old to run, I can't run.
Okay, we are going to start our class on how we got the Old Testament. It's not as easy as you think. It wasn't just a bunch of people sitting around writing in Hebrew and all of them sending it into a central location where it all got compiled and put together. No, no, no. If you notice, when you're reading what Christians call the Old Testament, is sometimes you find things that don't quite continue right. For example, if you're reading in the book of Genesis and you're reading let's start at the beginning. You have chapter 1, and it kind of looks like creation took 6 days plus a day of rest. When you read chapter 2, it retells the story, but it makes it sound like it's only 1 day. Which is it? 7 days or 1 day?
Or neither.
Or neither. Exactly right. Here's the thing. When we start talking about that, words become extremely important. Not just our words, our English words, but the Hebrew words. In Hebrew, there is a word, yom. It's actually like that. Yom is what usually gets translated as day. Now, that's absolutely fine. It can be translated that way, but it doesn't have to be translated that way, because actually, this word yom means a controlled period of time.
Recycle.
It's time to move on to the next one. Time. There we go. So, yom could be a day, could be an hour. It could be a geological age. It could be anything that is a specific. So when you're talking about several yoms, you're talking about several things that are matching in their duration, their time frame. Maybe it's 6 days, maybe it's 6 minutes. Maybe it's, and if we're talking about the Lord who's doing it, what took so long? Why did it take 6 days? Why couldn't it have been 1 day or 6 minutes or 6 seconds? Or here's the point. We have to ask ourselves the question pretty early on, what is our view of the text of the Bible? If we think that the Lord whispered into some scribe's ear and said, write this, then we're going to have some problems. Because, number one, the Lord then apparently has a very failing memory. And let's be honest, he's old. He can't be expected to be remembering all those details exactly. But if we look at this as something that has been inspired by the Lord, And inspired simply means, hey, why don't you write your experience? Hey, why don't you write what you're thinking about? I ask friends of mine who are songwriters, describe inspiration. Kind of get a feeling that, hey, I'd like to write a song. And I'm like, bingo. So when we look at the text of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, we find that there are some things that are not in complete agreement. That's okay. It doesn't diminish the power of the Bible. It doesn't make the Bible wrong. It doesn't do any of those things that some folks on TikTok would like to tell you, this is why you don't trust this anymore. No. When we look at the scriptures and realize that this is a collection of writings, a collection of collections of writings, and it's by human beings who are simply trying to figure out their place in the world. How did we get here? What is our relationship with God like? What does God ask of us? And you'll find that different people in different times are going to have different answers to that. There was a guy back in the 1860s. This guy's a hero of mine. His name was Julius Wellhausen. He was a professor of Hebrew Bible. And this guy was excellent in Hebrew and Aramaic, all the Semitic languages. And Wellhausen was reading the text of the Old Testament, and he realized that there were different names being applied to God. It wasn't always the same name. Sometimes you would see God as the most frequent use was the word Elohim. All right? Elohim. That's an old word for God. In fact, we wind up discovering that this is a word that was used even before the Hebrews. Back in the days of the Canaanites and of the Mesopotamian cultures, Elohim was a very popular use of the word. Now, when we see this word that ends with I am is usually plural. This. Now people go, see? It means that they believed in many gods back then. This is talking about all the gods. And when it's talking about God creating the heavens and the earth, and it uses this word, it's talking about more than one God. No. Because in Hebrew, if the word is going to be plural, it has to be accompanied by a plural verb. In Hebrew and Greek and some of the others, you have verbs like throw. We just have throw. One guy can throw it, 2 guys can throw it, 10 people can throw it. It's the same word. But in Greek and Hebrew and other languages like that, when you have one, this person was going out to throw the ball. Imagine if we had plural, these 2 people went out to throw the ball. Everybody would know, okay, that's plural. And so, in the same way, if Elohim is going to be a plural word for gods, plural, it has to be accompanied by a plural verb, and it never is. It's not. Here's the thing. In Hebrew, they don't have superlatives, like biggest, best, highest, all like that. So what they do is they pluralize a word to show something mightier. Okay, out in the state of Washington, there's a place there called Walla Walla. And it's referring to this big water that's there. And that was I forgot what nation of people it was, but these First Nation people, their word for water was Walla. But this was so big, they doubled the word. It became water. In the same way, Hebrew acted like that if you're using a singular verb with this, it's talking about how wonderful this God really is. This God is so great, it's like more than one God. I mean, this is one God is better than your 10 gods that you've got. Okay, so Wellhausen notices this, but he also notices one called Yahweh. And he was German, so the Y sound gets represented by a J. That one, you will see in your Bible, it'll be transliterated as all caps, L-O-R-D, Lord. When you see it as all capitals, that is referring to this name, and that is considered the proper name of God. Now, in Hebrew, it kind of looks like this, the 4 letters. It's called here's a big long word for you, the tetragrammaton. It just means 4 letters, that's all. But,
Can't do a quad.
yeah, really, wouldn't that be nicer? Why couldn't they have gone to Latin instead of, okay, tetragrammaton. Now, thing is that the Hebrews consider this name to be so holy, they can't even say it. They will say, they'll substitute the word Adonai, or sometimes I had a professor who was a Hebrew rabbi, Jewish rabbi, and he would always say, the unnamed one, bless his holy name. I mean, if he's going to say the word several times in a sentence, it gets a little tedious after a while. But he was faithful to it, and he would say, and then the unnamed one, bless his holy name, would go out and say, I am the unnamed one, bless my holy name. And this guy was so into it that I was sitting behind him at a lecture one time, and it was kind of an amphitheater-like setting. So I'm watching him take notes, and I'm watching his hand go like this, from right to left. So I leaned up and I looked at it. Sure enough, the guy is taking notes in Hebrew. Like, this guy's really good, really impressive. So anyway, Wellhausen says, so we've got these 2 sources. Now, there are many other different names for God. We'll see one simply called El. And that is maybe the most ancient of the bunch of them. We'll find that one used all throughout ancient Canaanite literature, but we'll also see use of the word Baal. Now, most of the time, we think Baal is the bad guy. Baal was, in fact, the storm god of the the Northwest Semitic folks, Canaanites, and like that. But in Hebrew, in the Hebrew writing, it simply means Lord, lowercase L-O-R-D, Lord or Master. It all depends on how it appears in the text. If that stands by itself, it could be talking about the Lord, could be talking about Yahweh, could be talking about the God of the Hebrews. But if you see it combined with something else, like there was one called, here we go, Baal Melkart, who was actually the deity that was worshipped by Jezebel, and it means the Lord of, what was it? The Lord of the heavenly abode. Well, this actually, Baal Melkart, was like a god of death. Pretty nasty. Now, you'll see another name that will appear as Baal Zebul. Or, we see it, most of the time is Baal Zebub. That was actually Jesus taking a nice shot at them, because Baal Zebul means the Lord high above. Jesus, and it was referring to a demonic figure, or rather a foreign deity. Jesus changes the name to Beelzebub, and it means the Lord of Flies. It was,
I remember seeing the apostrophe over it all the time.
you do remember?
I don't.
Oh, most of the time in English transliterations, they won't do that. Yeah. So, you've got then all the Ales. There's El Shaddai. You heard about that one. Amy Grant had a song that, was saying about that. And it just means the Lord Almighty, or God Almighty. There was, and then there was those that were using the word Yahweh, that would be like, and we translate that
The Y.
into with a Y, and we also add some words in there, into those consonants, and we made it into the word Jehovah. So we see in the Bible Jehovah Nisi, which is God is, or the Lord is my banner, or Jehovah Tzidkenu, which is the Lord my righteousness, I think. There is Jehovah Shammai, there's all these other things. Well, it winds up being 72 different words to reference the Lord. Back to Julius Wellhausen. He's looking at this, and he's seeing these things, and they never seem to cross over. There seems to be, in the text that he's reading, that when this person is using Yahweh, or this text is using Yahweh, it follows kind of a specific line of thinking and follows certain grammatical rules. When he sees Elohim being used, it follows a different set of rules. Well, then Wellhausen started noticing that different stories used different references to God. All right. So imagine you're reading in Genesis, and you're reading the flood story. So how many animals of each kind did Noah carry aboard the flood? I mean, aboard the ark.
Two of each.
Really?
So they say, where I read.
If you read down just a little bit farther, let me see, I'm going to borrow your text here. I'm almost there. Okay. Chapter 7 of Genesis. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and 1 pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate. And 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will sing," okay, so on and so on. So, 7. Then you go down a little bit farther, and you find in verse, let's start in verse 6. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came on the earth. And Noah with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals, and of animals that are not clean, and of birds, and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2. Which is it? Is it 7 by 7 of the clean and 2 by 2 of the unclean, or is it 2 by 2 of everything? Of course, that doesn't do anything for our salvation, one way or the other. But what it does point out is that if we were able to look at this in Hebrew, you would see a difference in the language, in the vocabulary, and certainly in the difference of the details. But look how close they are to each other. We start off in verse 2, take with you 7 pairs of each, and then down in verse 7, only 5 verses later, it changes the story. This is remarkable. It's wonderful. It doesn't, people are like, well, doesn't that shake your faith in the Bible? No, it's going to take a whole lot more than that. And frankly, I haven't encountered anything that would. So,
This is not a very often read verses.
Oh, no, no.
It doesn't do anything. for
No,
me.
no, why mess up a good story with the facts?
Exactly, exactly.
But when we look at the facts, then we can say, wait a second here. And Julius Wellhausen said, I think we're talking about two different sources. When he looked at it, okay, imagine all of us English speakers, and you take the letters of George Washington, and then you take the letters of John F. Kennedy, and compare them. They're separated by 150 years or so. They're separated by the way language is approached, by what we say, by our slangs even, by the different, and you could look at them, and I could put them together, shuffle the papers together, and you would look at it and go, oh, that's so nice. George is such a nice writer. He's turned page. What'd he do? Why did he? You would see a difference. For somebody like Julius Wellhausen and others like him, the Hebrew was so clearly different, he said there must be something different. So, Julius Wellhausen then begins to separate the instances where Yahweh is used and where Elohim is used. But then he found out that even then, sometimes there were differences. So he's looking at all of this text of, especially the Torah being the first 5 books of the Bible. We'll pause there for a second. First 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? Sometimes called the books of Moses, right? It was not called the books of Moses because Moses wrote it. Especially now, Wellhausen is saying this is not one person who wrote this. Rather, they're called the books of Moses because Moses is the central character in those stories. This is the lawgiver. Well, Wellhausen then says, all right, so we've got these different uses of the Lord's name or of identifying God, but it became clear that he could also see that there were certain pieces that kind of stood alone. One in particular was the book of Deuteronomy. Now, if we're questioning whether or not Travis has lost his mind, because we all know that Moses wrote the book of Deuteronomy, if you look at the very last verse of Deuteronomy, you remember what it says? And there was not a prophet like Moses, even unto this day. Now, how in the world could Moses have written that about himself? Either somebody else wrote it, or else Moses is the worst kind of prideful clairvoyant. He is predicting something about himself. No, we now know the time is much later than Moses. In fact, here's the thing that it's hard to break to you, is that the Hebrew language wasn't even fully developed by the time of Moses. Moses was writing in something else, if he wrote anything at all. Probably Egyptian, because that's where he was educated, that's where he grew up. So Wellhausen is like, okay, so I got the Yahwist writer, I'll call him, got the guy who uses Elohim, got Deuteronomy, who provides a lot of the history stuff that we'll see even in later books of the Bible, not just in this, but we'll see that in some of Joshua, we'll see it in Judges, we'll see it in places like that. And then he says, but there's also this whole different set where seems like there's a different writer who's writing all this stuff about Leviticus, which is all about what the priests should do, who writes about the rituals, who writes about, and sure enough, Wellhausen says, I got it. We'll call this guy the priestly writer. Obviously, it's someone who understands the functions of the priesthood. And so Wellhausen then proposes what we now call the documentary hypothesis. He says there are 4 sources. He calls them J, E, D, and P. J, the Yahwist, and remember, Wellhausen is German, so we would say Y, but J's good enough. E, who he calls the Elohist, the one who refers to God as Elohim. Then there is D, the Deuteronomist, the historian who wrote Deuteronomy and other bits, and P, the priestly writer. That was an excellent, excellent start. And it really held sway with scholars for a long time that we could start looking at different sections of the Bible. In fact, in my class, Professor Harrelson, my professor, he actually gave us, here's all the chapters. And he had us to mark in our Bibles. Sadly, I loaned that to somebody, which I never should have done, and never got it back. I could probably recreate it, but everything that was the J source was in yellow. We highlighted it all in yellow. Everything that was the E source, we highlighted it in pink. Everything that was D was in green, and everything that was in the P source was what? Blue. And so you could look through that, and it was actually kind of a remarkable tool to look through the Bible and go, so that's why things changed. So that's why. And you can see there's a mark off between verse 2 and verse 7 of Genesis chapter 7. It was different sources. Now, since that time, and since the great discoveries that have taken place in the 1940s and 50s, we had the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a big deal. There was places like Ras Shamra, another place that was excavated, and they found so much in the way of great clay tablets and things that helped so much with understanding the way that Hebrew had evolved. And we also found out that because of these discoveries at this one place called Ras Shamra, or Ugarit, we discovered a language called Ugaritic, which was actually kind of a cousin language or sister language to Hebrew. In these languages, we have a group of languages called the Northwest Semitic languages. And here you would find things like Aramaic and Ugaritic and eventually Hebrew. And Hebrew was strongly influenced by Aramaic and Ugaritic. Ugaritic was actually a dialect that belonged to the Canaanites. And Aramaic was basically in the kingdom of Damascus. Hebrew, of course, was Israel. Pardon me. And these languages all had a real significant impact on each other. When we discovered at Ugaritic, or at Ugarit, which was the place nowadays called Ras Shamra, that there were thousands of clay tablets written in this language, Ugaritic. Because of what we knew about Hebrew, because of what we knew about other languages like Akkadian or Chaldee or some of the other languages, Sumerian, we were able to start deciphering this language. And it was remarkable. The treasure trove of material that was in there was staggering, especially when scholars started translating it, and then biblical scholars started looking at it, and in many cases they said, uh-oh, this is Psalm number 48. And yet it's written before the time of David. It's written before the time when there was even a Hebrew culture. A lot of people immediately go, oh, see? The Hebrews copied from somebody else. Look, in those days, it was not a big deal to find a piece of literature and say, this expresses exactly what we feel. We should use this. It wasn't theft. It wasn't borrowing. It was, this is wisdom, and wisdom from anybody is good enough. In the book of Proverbs, we find a complete passage, a complete section that is almost verbatim from an Egyptian work called The Wisdom of Amenemope. And it's just lifted out of there. The Jewish folks said, don't care if it's Jewish or Egyptian or Chaldean or anybody. Wisdom is wisdom, and this is what we think. This is what passes for wisdom. And so we find a lot of stuff being then incorporated into the Psalms, into various other passages that we'll find. And it's fine because it all represents the wisdom that the Lord has bestowed on us. Here's the thing that'll get you, is that one of the oldest sections of the Bible, one of the oldest things that we have from the Bible is the book of Job. And Job is not a Jewish man. Job is a Gentile. We don't know exactly where he's from, but we know he's not Jewish. It shows what they thought, that whoever loves the Lord and is loved by the Lord is worthy to be recorded, worthy to follow them and to listen to what they say. Job's a lot of fun. We'll get onto that in a little bit. So, with these languages now, we start to see that there is a lot of inspiration. I don't want to use the word borrowing or copying. I want to say inspiration. That it inspired the Jewish writers, the Hebrew writers, who were writing texts of their own, or finding these texts and saying, we got to include this. We can't say it any better than this. That's not bad. Well, so in the study of Ugaritic, the tablets from Reshamra, a guy named Sigmund Malvinkel wrote a book called The Psalms in Israel's History. And he says in the introduction to that book, you cannot study the Psalms in a scholarly way unless you have studied Ugaritic. The Hebrew is great, that's fine, but you got to study the Ugaritic before that, because there was such a passage from what had been before the time of the Hebrews into the Hebrews and on beyond that. He was right. All of a sudden, language became the most important tool of scholarship. Archaeology was great, but what are you going to do with a clay tablet with a lot of scratches on there if you can't read the thing? So every scholar from then on started saying the first responsibility of the biblical scholar is languages. It's not enough to read Psalm 23 and say, that's nice. Yeah, that's good. This is what it's saying. When you read it in the original language, not even the original that may be Hebrew, but what goes beyond that, you see something much more profound, much more impactful, because there was a guy named Justin Martyr. He was a Christian, writing somewhere in the, 2nd century. And he talked about all these things that could be found in civilizations, in cultures, before Christianity, before even the Hebrews. And he came up with this great word. He called it the Logos Spermatikos. That is, Logos being, of course, word, Spermatikos being seed. He said, in every culture, you can find evidence of this, the Word of God acting as a seed. Why is it, he said, that you could look at some of the tales of ancient Greece and it sounds exactly like what happened to Christ? Why is it you hear some of these stories from Egyptian folklore, or from Canaanite folklore, or from the Babylonians, or any of those, and it looks like what we've been talking about? Justin says, because the Lord was always at work preparing for the coming of the Word. It's a compelling argument.
Or Native American.
Native American is an excellent example. You listen to a Native American spiritual teacher, it's the gospel. I mean, it just is. Or you even listen to, like the Hindus, and we think that the Hindus are so far different from us, and they're just not. Well, it's because they've got 33 million gods. We don't have that. No, they don't. They just simply tell you, we believe that God is so magnificent that it takes 33 million names to even come close to approaching the majesty of God. Well, I believe that. I mean, fortunately, we're only, we deal with 3. It's not the 33 million, so we gotta, take it easy on ourselves. But you look at all these things, all these teachings that have gone on, and if we listen with an open heart, and we're open-minded towards it, we can hear echoes of what we believe, of what we've been taught as well. So, back to Julius. He starts off with the documentary hypothesis, gave us the JEDNP, but then as those discoveries at Rosh Hashanah, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Tel El Amarna, and so many other places, started to reveal different evolutions of the language, so that they wound up saying now, well, there's not just a P source, a priestly writer. There's P1, P2, and P3. There's D1 and D2. That you have to take algebra in order to study the Hebrew Bible by the time it's all done. They even have started to break up the Elohist, and in many cases they're saying, well, the Elohist is actually sometimes using the word El, sometimes using the word El Elyon, and El Elyon is a very old word that is actually drawn from the, the Sumerians. The Sumerians had a word that evolved into El Elyon, which basically meant God Most High. All right, so we've got all these different names, and yet they all seem to be talking about the same God, but they're talking about God at different stages of their history, at different developments of their theology, and their history really starts to hammer them when they are traveling with Abraham. We're probably talking about 1800 BC, long time back. Now, by the time that Abraham starts his travels in 1800, it's going to be 1,000 years until the first Hebrew documents are written, almost 1,000 years. It's around the year 850 when the very first documents are written for the Hebrew Bible. But there's been writings long before that. Way back, maybe the earliest epic that we have, depends on who you talk to, it's called Gilgamesh. It's my favorite non-biblical story. A guy named Gilgamesh. He's the king of a city called Uruk. He's built this magnificent city with these huge walls, and he is a despicable character. He thinks that everything belongs to him, everything that's in his kingdom is his, and he can do with it what he wants to. And it says that the gods looked down on him and said, this guy needs a lesson or two. So, what do? They send him a friend. That'll do it. A friend who's going to be honest, who's going to tell him the truth, who's going to be absolutely frank with him. And the two of them go off and they fight these great monsters, Hubal, they fight this, all this stuff. And eventually, Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu is killed by this monster. And the story of pain and grief is absolutely amazing. But the story goes on that Gilgamesh is going to go and discover the source of things. We find out that they believe that the earth was kind of like a table, that everything is here, but underneath is water. This table actually floats on the water. Many times in the scriptures, we'll hear the scriptures refer to the earth and the water under the earth. It's still talking about that mindset of our world floats on water. But then there are, at the four corners, mountains. And these mountains hold up a dome, which is heaven. All right, what's the point of that? Well, along came a group of people who said, you know, that dome, I bet we could crack into that. Now, there's a bunch of lamps that hang there, stars, moon, sun, bunch of lamps that hang up there, so it could probably show us the way. So if we build this tower, we could actually reach up there to that dome, crack through that dome, and get up there and see what God's doing. Not a good idea. That winds up into the Hebrew Bible. Of course, the Tower of Babel. Where that was still their viewpoint, is that this dome was something that held back the waters, and it also was the place where God was. So, Gilgamesh now goes on, he winds up swimming down in the primordial waters, but he encounters a guy named Utnapishti. This guy named Utnapishti, he says, yeah, I've kind of seen it all. Gilgamesh says, yeah, wasn't there a flood that you were part of? Yeah, big flood. Well, what happened? And Utnapishti tells him this story that, yeah, we were on this boat. We were warned of the coming of this because people were just so awful. 3,500, 2,500 BC. So awful. So, after all this rain, we wound up coming to rest on some piece of rock, some hill someplace. So, I decided I was going to let a dove go. And it came back. So I let a raven go. It didn't come back. And then I let another dove go. And it came back with vegetation in its mouth. Wait a minute. I know this story. This is the story of Noah and the flood, written 2,000 years, maybe, before. Now, once again, I'm not one of those who goes, see, the Bible just stole this from the Epic of Gilgamesh. How about this? How about they were telling the same story? It was two different authors at two different times telling the same story that had been passed down. Once again, language becomes a great tool in helping us to understand where these stories come from. Now, was this flood, I don't mean to offend anybody, was it a worldwide flood? As far as they were concerned, it was. Now, the folks, the folks who were in the Americas, did they experience it? No, there's no archaeological, geological evidence to support that. But for the people who were in that region, every place they saw was flooded. As far as they knew, it was a worldwide flood. It's like John in the book of Revelation was talking about the Roman Empire, and he said that these people control every language and nation and population all over the world. No, it didn't. But it was certainly in control over John's world. These guys are not, look, there's no satellite photographs for these guys. As far as they're concerned, everything they see is everything there is. They might hear stories from someplace else, but even then, they don't think it's all that far away. So we have these different tales then that start to develop. The people go into to Egypt, 1800. They're traveling with Moses. Then traveling with Abraham. Then somewhere, we don't know, 1100 maybe is when they are all in Egypt. Finally, they're let go, and well, it'd have even been before that, because King Saul would have been about the year 1050 BC. And then you have David, of course, and Solomon, and on after that. But we're down in 850. The kings, the great kings are gone. Saul is gone. David's dead. Solomon's dead. And we're now coming to the point of the divided kingdom, when they divided into the north kingdom with its capital in some area, and the south kingdom with the kingdom of Judah, which had its capital in Jerusalem. And it's not until that time that they actually start writing in Hebrew. But here's the thing, is that, and this is, okay, it's fun for me. But when you look at the language, at Hebrew, we look at it today, and like the letter Aleph is kind of like this. All right, Aleph. That's what we would call the letter A. Right? Baith looks like this. Or B. Before then, it was more like pictograms. It wasn't letters. This is actually Aramaic letters. Before then, they were using pictograms. And the letter Aleph was symbolized by that. Well, it's a bull's head. This, Baith, was actually this, which is, all right, I'll just say ox. This was the floor plan of a tent. The tents that they lived in, being nomadic folks. So if this is an ox picture, and this is a floor plan picture, it shouldn't be any surprise to you that the word Aleph actually means strong. And the word Baith actually means house. Bethlehem is the house of bread. Bethel, the house of God. Now, here's another cool thing about Hebrew, is that when you, and I'll stick with the Aramaic writings, when you take those two words, or those two letters, Aleph and Baith, and you combine them into Av, and so you basically got the strong one of the house. That combination is the word Father. So you can actually not know Hebrew, but if you can identify what the pictures are, you can figure it out with a little bit of help. And then you start to, you realize that this is long before there are new, like Arabic numbers, no 1, 2, 3, nothing like that. No, they use letters. And so the first letter, Aleph, is 1, Baith is 2, Gimel is 3, on and on. So you can also take the letters, or take the word, and combine the numbers of the letters, and you find some pretty interesting stuff. Like, for example, father is 3. You take the number for mother, and it's, was it 27? No, 28. The number for child, you want to guess?
31.
There it is, 31. How cool is that? Also, that will come into play when we get to the book of Revelation, and we find that there is a beast, and the beast has a number, and it's the number of his name. And John says, takes wisdom to calculate the number of the beast, meaning you got to count up the letters. And when you do, you find out that 666 is the sum total of the name Nero Caesar. That's who John was talking about. Nero and the Roman Empire. Well, so you've got this great, magnificent language that is now, you can actually look at the Hebrew Bible and see the development of this language. See how words start to change a little bit. And see how all these different uses and time frames of the use of these language helps us to figure out when these things were written. All that to say, Genesis was not the first book written in the Bible. In fact, Genesis is kind of way down the line. Exodus was not next. Exodus was not even written during the time of the Exodus. Same goes for Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Those things were written at a later time as, like I told you from the beginning, these guys are trying to figure out how did we get here and what is our place in the world and what does this mean for our dealing with other people in the world and for dealing with each other as well. That's the whole point of the Hebrew Bible. It's not supposed to be a history book. It's not supposed to be a science book. It's not supposed to be any of those things. It's a group of people saying, how did we get here? And now that we're here, what are we supposed to do? How did we get into Babylon? How did we get into Egypt? What happened? And so writers came along who started to tell the story of this is what happened. Now, here is maybe the most important thing about the writing of the Hebrew Bible. And that is catastrophe. Trauma and catastrophe will make people think fast and hard about recording their history because they're not sure they're going to be around. They want to leave that story for somebody else. So we had in back in the day the divided kingdom. So by the year, we'll just say 950. 950, all of a sudden, the kingdom of Israel was now split into two kingdoms. The north kingdom, which was called Israel, and the south kingdom, which they called the kingdom of Judah. Reason for that is because the north kingdom was 10 tribes. The south kingdom was only the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Somewhere in the 800s, along comes a group, the Assyrians. And the Assyrians just wipe out the north kingdom. The 10 tribes were dispersed. They went all kinds of places. In the South Kingdom, though, they managed to keep alliances, to make treaties. They stayed alive until around the year, we'll say 590 BC. A guy from Babylon comes along. Nebuchadnezzar. This guy was known as the destroyer of cities. And when he first gets there, he takes a bunch of people off into captivity, off to Babylon, and everything's fine. Judah pays its tribute. Everything's going to be okay. Along comes another king in Judah, and he goes, no, we can throw these people off. We don't need to. And the prophet Jeremiah says, wouldn't do that because this guy is called the what? Destroyer of cities. Don't argue with this guy. Just pay your tribute and be done with this guy. Well, no, they wouldn't hear of it because the false prophets all said, no, O king, you can rise up against Nebuchadnezzar. He's nothing compared to you. Besides, we have the temple here. God would never let the temple be destroyed. And Jeremiah goes, Yeah, you guys just don't know how wrong you are. The temple is not going to save you. It's a building. He says it's not going to save you. But we've got the Ark of the Covenant here, we've got all this stuff here, we got everything. Yeah, not gonna save you. This guy is the, what was it again? Destroyer of cities. And he's looking this way now. Well, they don't listen to Jeremiah. Jeremiah winds up being thrown in prison over all this stuff. Finally, who comes knocking? Jeremiah, Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar destroys the walls of the city, destroys the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, God knows where it goes. If you listen to Indiana Jones, it wound up someplace in Egypt, but I don't think it went there. Nobody knows where it went. We're not even sure if it was really still around at that point. Still, Nebuchadnezzar sends word to Jeremiah and said, hey, heard what you prophesied. And Jeremiah's like, look, I'm not your buddy. I'm just simply telling everybody, you're not somebody to be messed around with. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm not going to take you into captivity. You can go and do what you want to do. Well, that's great. Well, a bunch of refugees wind up grabbing poor Jeremiah and hauling him off down to Egypt. To die in Egypt was the worst thing imaginable for a prophet of the Lord. Well, so all this now has happened. The prophets have been taken away. Some of the ones that, one of the writers of Isaiah, we'll get into that later, one of the writers of Isaiah goes into deportation in Babylon. So many other prophets disappear. Jeremiah is taken away. The walls of the great city have been leveled and the temple is flattened. It was trauma. So we look at like the book of Lamentations. We look at all these other stories that talk about the destruction of the temple, and these people are suffering from trauma. There's been so much great work that's been done that's talked about the way trauma affects our recollection, the way that we see things. We can see that in the gospel writers with the destruction of Jerusalem all over again. This was horrifying. This was unthinkable that the house of God should be flattened that way. So we wind up now with these people who are in captivity and they're not sure they're ever going home again. Go home to what? There's no city there. Oh, I mean, okay. There's buildings and there's a few shepherds who are letting their goats in and out of the houses that used to be there. But there's nothing to go back to. And the people of Israel are saying to themselves, are we even going to be remembered? Is anybody even going to know anything about us? We've traveled through the deserts and we've seen ruined places and we always ask, well, what was that? Don't know. Don't know who that was. Is that what's going to happen to us? Imagine thinking like that. Imagine that we get wiped out by whatever. And to think that we're not going to be remembered, that those of us, the things that we built, the things that we did, the things that we taught and believed all disappear. There's a great Star Trek Next Generation episode. They encounter this probe and it makes this connection with the captain, Captain Picard, who falls asleep and he winds up dreaming this whole lifetime. It's my favorite episode. It's called The Inner Light. When he wakes up, he can do things that he was taught as if he had lived this life. He can play this flute. He can read this language. He knows all this history about this place. And then the probe shuts off and it's gone. All these people wanted was somewhere in the future, somebody would encounter this and would remember them. That's the thing that we're talking about here. That's the creation of the Hebrew Bible, is somebody has got to remember us. The great thing about all that is that the Lord in His mercy said, there will be a time you can go home. There will be a rebuilding. And not only will there be a rebuilding, but the blessing of the nations will come from you. But at this point, when they're in Babylon, it doesn't look like there's any kind of future for them. The prophets will have great things to say, great things to messages to pass on to them from the Lord. But for these guys, we gotta write this down and we gotta write it down now. And so we wind up with all the stories of the Garden of Eden, the flood, and different people in different places were writing the same stories down. So I don't know about you, I think it's pretty remarkable they got as close as they did, seeing that they were separated by years and time, years and space from each other, and not cooperating with each other and saying, how many are going on? How many you got going on? 2? I got 7. Leave them both in there. No, it wasn't like that at all. They were far apart from each other. And yet, they kept giving us this consistent story that no matter what we did wrong, no matter how stupidly we may have acted, no matter how bad our choices were, Lord always brought us back. That's worth saving. That is why all the other so-called discrepancies are just minor stuff. It doesn't mean anything. The big picture is God is merciful, and God will always call his children, their children, back home to him. So, that's been an hour. It's a good place to start. Next time, then, we will think. Next time we'll start with probably the book of Job, since it's the oldest. And I'm going to try to go, it's not always possible, but try to go in a chronological manner so that you can see what writings were influencing the next writings. And with Job, there's nothing influencing Job. It's the first of the stories. And yet it asks the question that we still ask today, why do bad things happen to good people? Back in the 1990s, a guy named Harold Kushner wrote a book with that title, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's the question that we'll always ask, I suppose. And fitting, Job should be the first to ask it. So, that's where we can stop for tonight and see you in a couple of weeks. But first, any questions or observations or criticisms or?
So when did the Torah, the 5 books, when did that then become the basis of Jewish religion?
It was a while. Now, for example, during the time of Josiah, right? We're going to say 625 BC. 625 BC, it says that the high priest, under orders of King Josiah, was cleaning out the temple. And in the storage room, he found this scroll. And it was the scroll of Deuteronomy, he said. So, we know there's not a Torah before 625 because now they've discovered the scroll of Deuteronomy. Before him, King Hezekiah had apparently been cleaning out the same place and didn't find that. What he did find, interestingly, was the brass snake. Remember that Moses held up in the... I love this story. Hezekiah was awesome because he says, yeah, just get rid of that thing. And they're like, but this is the Lord. And he says, his answer is, it's a thing of brass. Why are you trying to make this thing a holy thing? It's representative of something holy. Well, now, however many years later, Josiah is in there, or the high priest is in there, cleaning out the temple. Here's Deuteronomy. When did it get put into that storage room? Because Hezekiah was cleaning out the same place. When did it get put in there? A lot of people think that King Josiah had, commissioned the writing of this scroll so that it could be the support or the basis for his reform, the Josiah reform it was called, where he's going to change the way Israel worships. They're going to centralize worship in the temple in Jerusalem, and Hezekiah had tried to do that too, had destroyed like different cult sites around, or shrine sites I should say, around the countryside. So by 650 now, or 625, we've got the Deuteronomy scroll, okay, but we still don't see it being talked about as a Torah for probably another couple of hundred years. But not only do you have the Torah at that time, you already have different psalms that have been written. I mean, clearly some of them came from the Canaanites. We've found a whole bunch of psalms from the time is, and okay, a lot of them are called the Psalms of David. Could be, but the Hebrew preposition for that we translate as of could also mean for or in the style of. So I'm not saying David never wrote a psalm, but I'm saying that everything that says it is a psalm of David may not necessarily be. And linguistically, some of them don't hold up. They're different. They use vocabulary from different times, but that's okay. It's written in the style of David. It's written in commemoration of David. So you've got psalms that are written. You've already got prophets who have started writing. Isaiah of Jerusalem, okay. There's actually 3 sections of Isaiah. Sections 1 through 39 are referred to as First Isaiah or Isaiah of Jerusalem. This is written during the Assyrian period, back in the 8th century BC. Then there's a second section which goes from chapter 40 through chapter 60. Most people will say, yeah, 60. And that's called Second Isaiah. That person who's writing then is writing during the time of exile. There's also many psalms that come from there. Remember, one of the psalms, by the waters of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. Well, all of that is talking about being in captivity. They're sitting by the river Euphrates and they're remembering Zion is no more. We wept when we hung our harps on the willow trees, it says. Then there is a third section of Isaiah, which looks to be after the return. And again, there's really good evidence for it. In chapter 60, verse 1, remember it says, "Arise, shine, for the light has risen upon you, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." It's talking about we're going home. We get to go back. Cyrus the Great was allowing a group of people, of the Israelites, to go back to Jerusalem, and we're talking about like probably somewhere around the year 540 BC. They're going back to Israel now, and they are rejoicing. So in Isaiah, you have 3 distinct sections, 3 distinct authors from 3 distinct time periods. But that, again, is what makes Isaiah so remarkable, is because one part we read, it's about impending doom. Second part, doom is on us. Third part, it's over and we get to go back home rejoicing. Good stuff. So, again, all that to say, it's not going to be until really like the 3rd century BC, 200s, yeah, when you start to have a collection starting to come together. But the Bible as we know it, what we look in here, the Hebrew Bible, that doesn't take its final shape until the year 90 AD. Yes. After Christ has been crucified, resurrected, and has ascended back to heaven, then the Jewish council comes together at Jamnia and says, we need to say what's exactly in our Bible. What caused that? Because the Christians were using the same books, and the Jews are like, we can't let them have that. Those are our books. And the Jewish Christians, of course, are all going, yeah, but we're all part of the same big family, right? We can use that. No, these are ours. And so they listed out, these are the books that will be in there. So it's not until the year 90 that you have a complete Hebrew Bible, or what we would call the Old Testament.
Holy cow.
Now, sorry, be careful about asking me questions.
We were warned, you know.
That's right, you were born.
Huh.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and
Thank you.
don't forget the snack.